Welcome to the package group iteration retrospective on the 8th of April 2020. This is a discussion intended to work through what's gone well and what's gone poorly in terms of iteration in our group. We have a particular format we're using, and this is an effort to sort of improve long-term our iteration and focus on it a little more. Starting off with what went not so well. Steve, I think you have the first item.
Yeah, so the first thing that came to mind for me was just building dependent MRs has pretty much never ended up working for me. And so the first example that I had of that was when I worked on Conan. I had one very complex MR that was followed up by 3 somewhat smaller MRs, and even one that branched further off of one of those. And so I kind of had finished all of them before I submitted any of them to the review. And of course, the complex MR had many changes, lots of refactoring, and that led to tons of merge conflicts, rebasing, all of this sort of a mess, and having to keep all of those other MRs clean, even though they weren't even in review yet. And so my takeaway was, you know, if you can help it, don't branch off of unreviewed code if you don't have to, and possibly even wait to work on those subsequent MRs until the first one is further along. Like just work on something else rather than trying to get further ahead because you're just creating more work for yourself. It looks like I'm curious about David's comment as a follow-up.
Yeah, well, I had the opposite experience with the NuGet MVC, and I used the Git trick that is linked in the article, which is when you have a fork of a fork, the second fork needs to be handled in a special way so that you can reconnect to the first fork when the first fork has changes. Yeah, that's pretty complicated, but in the article you have some images that explains things well. And I had 2 levels of forks, so a fork of a fork and a fork of a fork of a fork, and it ended up working pretty well for me.
Cool. I'll jump on my second example, which was recent, working on the API for the deploy tokens. So there were 7 endpoints, and I decided to try an experiment where I created 7 MRs, one for each endpoint, that seemed mostly independent. And I also went ahead and stuck with roulette for all of the reviewers, since it wasn't strictly a package feature, and most of the MRs were fairly straightforward and not domain specific. And that led to a really large variance in reviews with similar endpoints. Like I have like the create deploy and the create endpoint for project deploy tokens ended up looking very different than the one for group deploy tokens, even though they essentially do the same thing, just because there was different opinions on how authorization should work, how different other things should work. But they were both in review at the same time, so you couldn't really see what was happening between them. And so my takeaway there was, sticking with some of the same reviewers would certainly have helped speed up that process because they would have already had context. And since it took me less than a day to write all 7 MRs, they were very like simple code changes overall. It probably wasn't the best idea to necessarily split them that much just because I could. It might have made more sense to at least group similar pieces together for review. And I believe Nico has the next point here.
Yeah, so this is just the sentence that I copy paste every time I do split MR on multiple things. I will assign the same reviewer and the same maintainer, and I will go, hey, person, since you already have context on this, could you also review this as well? So all the conversation that we had up until now is not vanished, and we can start building on top of that.
And I do think this was more of I was kind of curious what would happen if I did that, just to see the variance and whether or not I got different things from the different reviews that were helpful in different ways. And there were some things that were helpful. Dan, you have a question?
Yeah, the question was really, do merge trains help with these dependent MRs? Would this be something that would be helpful, or you still end up getting the same reviewer, the differences in the process?
I think in my two examples, it would not have been helpful because the changes were so significant in Conan that I had to completely rewrite those subsequent MRs. What I had originally written would not have worked at all. And then with the deploy tokens, it's possible that could have helped a little bit.
Cool, thank you. You're up next, Nico.
Yeah, I was
Unless
reading David comment, but okay, I'll go with the next.
Sorry, wait up, Nico. David, do you want to verbalize that comment? Sorry, thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, I guess I can't speak and write at the same time. So on the Nugget MVC again, I had one maintainer for the backend changes, and he followed several of the MRs. But for the last MRs, he called me out to not choose him as a maintainer, to promote different point of views, and perhaps he was having a biased opinion since he was following the whole thing. So it's a balance where if you choose always the same, I guess you then tunnel the whole process, but at the same time you need to be fast. So using the same one again and again promotes the context, knowledge and sharing. So it's hard to balance that.
I'm not sure that it's just about speed, because if you have one set of work and it has 20 different flavors, because you have different set of reviewer and different set of maintainer with different opinions, you may end up with a very non-homogeneous code that it's not so easy to read at the end of the day. I mean, especially for the same functionality, we already have this across the full product because we are all different engineers, and that's normal. But the exactly same piece of functionality written into a different accent, I don't think it's really helpful for quality as well. But that can be my opinion, though.
Cool. Let's move on to the next one. Just trying to keep an eye on time here. So Nico, if you.
Yeah. Okay. So I think working with feature flag is powerful and important, but adds in some cases a lot of workflow complexity, and this means that discourage iterate. So from one side, feature flag enable iteration. From the other side, they may discourage it, because if you do a small iteration, I need to set up a feature flag and do all the process that is behind it, put, remove, take care of it, and this kind of stuff. It's much easier in my mind that I will start to clump in feature just to spread the workflow cost of a feature flag on a substantial thing. And I think this defeats a little bit the iteration idea. On the other end, they enable iteration. So I'm not sure how this can be done better, but I think that in some cases there are issues about it. If there are no comment, I go to the next. Okay. And the other thing is that due to having Rails, Go, and front-end code, whenever we have to test something, we have a little bit of a harder path to follow sometimes, because it spans 3 different products, especially if you want to test manually. And I felt that in some cases we don't have the tools and the access to do so. See, for example, the container registry expiration policy, that we really had to wait 1 week to test them while we were ready to test them, because there was no way to do this differently. And this is another thing that discourages iteration, because if I can't test my work, I can't produce anything on top of it, and everything is stuck. And I think Joao has a comment about it.
Yeah. Do you think that we need the documentation, or it's mostly about random setup issues? So something stops working or is not working as documented?
Well, a bit of it is like the difference between like the GTK environment and what is like the production server. But mostly I was referring on testing, on staging, and production, where we can, for example, access the console, or to access the registry, at least you need to piggyback into other people.
When you say console, is it the Rails console?
Well, I know that that's a bit of a big shot, just as an example, but in the case of the expiration policy, there was just the necessity to say, okay, this thing was created 1 week ago and not now, so that we can test expiration policy right now. And we really had to wait 1 week.
Okay, usual deal applies. Sorry, did you have another question, David?
Yeah, couldn't have you asked for a maintainer who has write access to the Rails console to execute the command or something like that?
I did open an issue in the infrastructure team, and it just didn't move for 1 week, and then the time passed and it went through.
I mean, I do think we've kind of followed this problem up a little bit so that hopefully we won't run into quite as big of problems. Like I know, like some of myself, I as a result of this, I got console access for staging, and I know we've explored other areas for how we can prevent this from happening in the future. But certainly, there's still places to grow.
Cool. Yeah, so remember everyone, this meeting works like all our regular meetings, which is, once you're finished and you don't have any comments, just hand off to the next person. So Haley, you're up next, I think.
Right, thank you. Yeah, so we're doing a lot of foundational work with the container registry in relation to implementing the metadata database. And so lots of stuff is just being newly created, and there's bigger MRs and issues that cover a broader sort of theme than normal. And yeah, do you want to verbalize your comment, Dan?
Thanks, Haley. Yeah, I was just wondering if there's any way to avoid it. It sounded like you were you're explaining kind of something that was necessary. So I'm wondering if there's a way to avoid.
I don't think so. I think we're managing, and I think that's kind of the nature of the situation, is that it's a non-ideal situation that we're handling, rather than something that's wrong in the process. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I just want to preface this by saying I think you're both doing excellent work there, and it is a really big deal that we're working on there. So I totally understand, but the advice here is to think about building a roller skate, not half a car, right? So like, could there be a way when we're evaluating this to say, oh, okay, well, we need this one table, and this is not a good example because I recognize there's a lot of dependencies in this effort that you're putting together. You want to look at it and say, is there a way we could build a smaller set of functionality to release first with less overhead, if you hadn't already? Because I think you've both, again, done excellent work here. So that's kind of the thought process around whether you feel like you could avoid this type of work, is the question of, can we release a smaller set of functionality faster and then iterate on that?
Right. Yeah. I think Steve has the next point.
Yep. I've noticed that we've had quite a few issues that get scheduled and then sort of mid-milestone, the scope is revised when more information is discovered as we work through them. And I think that's actually kind of a what went well in that we're able to make those revisions on the fly. But since that does sort of happen maybe once or twice per milestone, at least that's kind of what I've seen or think I've seen, it makes me think that perhaps we could improve on that planning before we get to that point. If no one has anything on that, we can move over to what went well. And I have the first item here. And this is relating to the investigation issues we've been doing on new package managers. I think they've been very valuable. And I do think it's been very difficult to measure whether or not they're saving time in how quickly we develop the package managers. But I think I can confidently say that they are a great deal of help in understanding what types of MRs need to be created, and then also the overall findings and breakdown of how the package manager works has been super helpful to me when I'm not actively working on that implementation and following along those MRs, because it gives me an idea of how the package manager works, so that when I do eventually use it or work on it, I have some sort of a context and I'm not just going in blind. The second item I have a lot of items, I guess, is the milestone planning issue and functional board. I think they're awesome. I think the milestone issue helps us understand what's possible and what issues still need work before starting development. And then that functional board is quite possibly the only board I work off of to see what I need to work on and what others are working on. And I think those tools have both increased our efficiency and awareness of what everyone is working on in the group. Jean, do you have a comment there?
Yeah, I find the planning issue to be especially useful because we can bring the whole team to the same place to discuss before we actually commit to do something. And I think that's especially important because we have a multifunctional team. So Go, Ruby, front end, back end. So that's especially important for me. To team.
I had one small note, which was that looks like our average weight per issue over the past 3 milestones has dropped from 3.25 to 1.75, which is, I think, a really good sign that we're iterating better as well. So it's cool.
All right, and my last point for what went well is I've found that rather than having sort of a strict rule, and this kind of builds off of what not went well for me, but rather than having a strict rule of, front-end MRs and back-end MRs should be split, or if I'm working on a back-end MR, or issue, I should split it into as many small pieces as possible and kind of think through those iterations before I even start on them. I've started to focus more on sort of living in the gray area of looking at, how much work I'm doing rather than trying to think about it ahead of time before I even start the work. And so if it only takes me an hour or two to write an MR that has a whole bunch of areas of code, I should just do that and submit it to review at once rather than creating a migration, submitting that to review, waiting a few days for that to get through review, then creating the next MR, and then having that thing that overall took me only a couple hours to write span over a week or so. And so I lost my place here. But in other words, sort of just letting the complexity and velocity of the MR dictate whether or not and when it goes into review, rather than trying to figure that out before I start writing it. Nico?
Yeah, so I wanted to add to this that I think this is a good approach, but you also need to factor in the dependencies between the pieces, because you may have the UX review it and then do some changes, and then the backend reviewer said, no, this is not gonna be okay, and now the front end needs to be reviewed again, and now suddenly this UX is not possible, and so I found myself catched in this kind of stuff. So just a little bit of advice. If there is no other comment, I move to the next point, which is mine. So I think that the two proof of concept that we did help the conversation to move forward and enable iteration. One is live now, the other is still there, scheduled to be worked on. But I know that proof of concept are not like super well seen across the org. Maybe we should do something more, or maybe not, or maybe we're just lucky.
I think, and I'm not going to try and type at this and talk at the same time because I'm not good at that either. But I think the important point here with the proof of concept is we try to avoid it because there's a potential loss of work. Like if it's not applied, it goes away. And so that you spend all this time, and it can be really fun and we can learn things. So it's not entirely lost, but the effort that we put into it it's important, and this is why we talked about it in advance, is it's important to evaluate it and say, okay, what things would we avoid doing if we were not going to keep this code? And I think you both made, Nick and Nico, you both made good decisions around, okay, let's not test it as much as we would. We can add that afterwards and still evaluate the proof of concept to determine whether it's actually something we want to move forward with. I'm going to approach it like we're going to still build this feature. And it's going to be released, but how do we save time? So I think that was a good way to approach it. It's really just looking at a proof of concept and saying, okay, it isn't the answer to every question, but how can we make our effort reusable as much as possible? And I think you both did a great job with that, just to be clear. Haley's diligently trying to take notes and yet has the next item. Sorry, Haley, I'll finish off those notes. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of upstream changes on master Docker distribution that are not yet incorporated into our release branch of the repository. And so I think we did a pretty good job of, and we specifically as Dan, Jean, and I did a really good job of factoring this out and writing discrete units of work without making it heavy-handed or bureaucratic. So I think that was just like a nice little success in planning. All right. And I think the next item is struck through. So I don't know what to do. So Dan, do something.
I think there's probably useful discussion if someone had an action item, because we're in action items now, and then it got struck through. So Stephen, David, do you want to just start with that?
My first thought earlier was, we should document maybe what we expect and want to have in our little investigation issues. But David points out that we already did that. So I just need to refamiliarize with some of our own documentation.
Cool. All right. That is all we have on the agenda. Thanks for sharing that, Steve. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I apologize. I think I'm going to end the recording here. We're at time. I would like to see just if people could follow up on the document and let me know whether they felt like this was useful. And we can kind of end it there. I'm going to stop recording. Thank you for everyone for following along at home. I think this is a good example of how we can demonstrate our transparency value by having these conversations in a live stream. But thanks, everybody. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, and we'll see you later.